witness and his universe, he stood in a realm of boundless silences. Above the witness and his universe, he stood in a realm of boundless silences, awaiting the voice that spoke and built the worlds. A light was round him, wide and absolute. A diamond purity of eternal sight. A consciousness lay still, devoid of forms, free, wordless, uncoerced by sign or rule, forever content with only being and bliss. A sheer existence lived in its own peace, on the single Spirit's bare and infinite ground. Out of the sphere of mind he had risen. He had left the reign of nature's hues and shades. He dwelt in his self's colorless purity. It was a plane of undetermined spirit that could be a zero or round sum of things, a state in which all ceased and all began. All it became that figures the absolute, a high, vast peak whence spirit could see the worlds, calm's wide epiphany, wisdom's mute home, a lonely station of omniscience, a diving board of the Eternal's power, a white floor in the house of all delight. Here came the thought that passes beyond thought. Here the still voice which our listening cannot hear. The knowledge by which the knower is the known. The love in which beloved and lover are one. All stood in an original plenitude, hushed and fulfilled before they could create the glorious dream of their universal acts. Here was engendered the spiritual birth. Here closed the finite's crawl to the infinite. 1,000 roads leaped into eternity, or singing ran to meet God's veilless face. The known released him from its limiting chain. He knocked at the doors of the unknowable.
Speak up a little bit more.
Yeah, I'll speak up. Just look at the picture. Can you see it?
So it's nice to see the still lake. Sri Aurobindo uses this image frequently. The still self. And then you can see in the center a kind of pyramid, a natural rock formation. And there's a little cloud catching the sunlight on the rock formation. And Sri Aurobindo also uses this image of the pyramid quite a bit. And then there are some slopes which table off or continue rising. So the philosophy of consciousness is a bit like this. And I'm happy to say that this book just got published this week, and it has in it 12 lectures that I have given on the philosophy of consciousness. So I don't need to say anything anymore. Everything that I have to say is in this book. These lectures were given here in Oroville, along with others that are somehow incorporated, which have been an attempt to understand this paradigm of integral knowledge in a context, in the context of the development of consciousness in the modern age. Because the paradigm that we've been looking at is the product of a mythical age. And Vladimir has made the point of the mythical re-emerging in the rational or beyond the rational with another more comprehensive understanding than it originally had even. And Sri Aurobindo's philosophy is about that more comprehensive understanding. After commenting on the Upanishads, he wrote a few thousand pages of philosophy that actually transcend that vision. So I'm going to review some of those ideas. In this book, there are four sections. The first one is the movement of the subjective age, from epistemology to phenomenology. And then the second one is the movement of the subjective age from science to cosmology. And the third section is specifically on Hegel and Sri Aurobindo. So the subtitle at the bottom is Hegel and Sri Aurobindo. I'll read a few passages from there. But this idea of the subjective age, which we could see in the stratified hierarchy as something following the rational age. As I said yesterday, this is not a static concept. And so the various structures emerge, and one is coming to fruition while the other one is beginning to emerge. And so the subjective age, I believe, began to emerge in the 18th century, basically, 1750 about. The foremost signs of which were the philosophies of Hume and then Kant, who expanded Hume's ideas, and then Hegel. And we can find in Sri Aurobindo's philosophy a restatement of the ideas of Hume and Kant and Hegel. And then in the 20th century, we have a number of philosophers, Bergson and Whitehead and Sri Aurobindo, who have synthesized completely that early period of subjectivism, where for the first time, huge books were written about consciousness. Consciousness came into awareness around 1750. And since that time, and especially today, huge amounts of time and money and intellectual energy are being spent to try to decide what this is. So throughout this book, I'm asking the question, what is consciousness? We can describe its many operations, and this has been done for millennia. So the idea of vijnana, ajnana, samjnana, and prajnana, these were ideas that were being explored in the 17th and 18th and 19th century in ways that are similar to the ways they were explored in the days of Plato and Vyasa. Because these are realities of consciousness, and whenever consciousness concentrates on itself and tries to understand itself, it discovers these principles. I think that it's no longer relevant, really, to say that these four principles are secret operations. They're actually quite well known. And they become, we would call them today universals. So the idea that consciousness knows ahead and then determines action on the basis of what it intuitively knows ahead, and then it formulates an immediate mental understanding of the means for that movement ahead, and it apprehends and comprehends the process that it is involved in, which it has intuitively known and willed to unfold. You know, this fourfold activity of consciousness is ever present with us. The more we develop our higher intuition, the more we become aware of that atemporal dimension, and we become more conscious that we knew already. But as long as we're in the apprehending and comprehending level, we're discovering what we knew already. And this is how the mind works. Hume observed in 1750 that from our apprehension of stimuli outside are generated ideas, which are like some kind of abstract formulation of that which we observe. And he said something interesting at that time already. He said the difference between the perception or apprehension of stimuli and the idea is only a difference in vividness. And the immediate perception strikes the soul more vividly than the idea. But the idea is still the same as that which struck the soul in the first place. And from the very beginning, with Plato and Aristotle, there was a perception of identity between the knower and the known. And it was in traditional times assumed that consciousness was the link between the knower and the known. But then along came skepticism, and in various periods of time, we realized that it's not necessarily true. That what we know isn't necessarily what's there. And so the mind, in its processing and representation of the world, can make mistakes. But still, there is this mysterious connection. So obviously, we don't always make mistakes, and the practical mind is generally pretty efficient. But it doesn't base its understanding and its actions on truth, necessarily. It's more interested in achieving results. And our species is famous for this. We are embodiments of the practical mind. And as it was pointed out yesterday, all of these structures of consciousness, from cells to nervous system, to organs of perception, to ideation, and determination of action, and eventually understanding patterns and concepts. Each of these levels is a structure of consciousness. So there is consciousness, and there are the structures of it. Now, what has happened in the most recent time, with a more intuitive understanding, that is to say, a more comprehensive, higher intuitive understanding of the relationship between the knower and the known, which has been written about by Sri Aurobindo and Bergson and Whitehead and a few others. We've realized that what Hegel was saying a couple of hundred years ago is that the mind understands eventually these universal patterns. And so we see perception, and we see life, and we see the, in humanity, rational organization of things, not as something which is just happening in our brain, but something which is happening generally. Consciousness is expressing itself in each and every one of us, and in every single organism, and throughout the earth plane and the universe. These principles are operative everywhere. This is universalizing consciousness. Consciousness becomes capable of universalizing itself at a higher level of rationality. So Hegel explained that there is the Humean perception and ideation, and then there is understanding, which comes as a result of conceptualizing, and then on the basis of that conceptualizing, consciousness goes another step above that and realizes that in its perception of the universal, it is touching the reality of all of those manifestations throughout time and space of that universal. That universal is not just an abstract conception. It is an actual reality that has innumerable manifestations throughout the world. And at that point, consciousness knows the universal as itself. Consciousness is that universal manifesting all of those perceptions, all of those wills to achieve or to survive, all of that world of phenomena which are to the lower mind appearances of things, through a higher understanding become the essence of the things themselves. The truth, the force, the manifestation of all of these universals that we perceive, media, for example, the whole technology of media and communication, we perceive not as a lot of microphones and projection screens, but we perceive that world of communication as the world of communication. And we know that communication is enhancing the success and unity and expression of the human being. So the success and the unity and the expression of the human being are universals, and we all participate in those universals. Everything that we know is a universal that we and everything else participates in. And then in the postmodern age, with certain thinkers, it is realized that this is our truth. This is the truth of consciousness, that it is universal and we are all participating in it. Now, this is a problem for science still, but Whitehead was a scientist, and there are some scientists today who are edging towards philosophy, some of them are almost willing to accept the idea that consciousness is not just a kind of reflection that is generated by the mind of the human being, that consciousness has a reality in itself that is universal, and that in fact the molecules are structures of consciousness. But it's not widely accepted. Usually today, especially in neuroscience and cognitive science, there is still a strong bias towards believing that consciousness is just a subjective phenomenon of the human mind. And there are many people even today, even sophisticated scientists today, who say that animals are not conscious, that they're automatons, and consciousness is really the ability of the human being to reflect on itself, to be aware of its own knowing. So consciousness is self-consciousness still today in the view of many scientists. But there are other scientists and many philosophers who understand differently. And this is significant. And Sri Aurobindo's thinking is really the paradigm of this idea that consciousness is also the force of that which it knows. That the consciousness working in the sort of apparently unconscious realm of matter, which is sensation and perception and the ability of molecules to adhere to each other meaningfully so that life forms, that all of that is happening because those molecules and formations and attractions and repulsions are consciousness itself. And therefore we have a purposive evolution on Earth. But the idea of purpose and teleology have been offensive to science for quite some time. A few hundred years, not so long, but the idea that everything is for a purpose and there's a reason for everything is basically a philosophical idea, not a scientific one. But it's very important today for science to cross this line because the empirical sciences, in believing that knowledge is abstract, an abstract product of the human being, and that the world outside can't really be known as such. That's the fundamental truth of empiricism. Gives us a kind of freedom to do whatever the hell we like with nature, because we don't know that it even exists as something other than our own thought and our own constructs, and so we can do anything with it that we like. And this is the typical scientific attitude. Of course, we have ethical reasons for doing what we do, and we expect that the Dakota pipeline is going to give us a lot more energy to run our ships and planes, but it doesn't matter that it disrupts the environment and a whole nation of people. In recent times, there have been some quite radical reactions in Germany, for example, against animal experimentations, because some photographs got leaked of poor chimpanzees that were dripping fluids from every orifice because of the chromium plates that were inserted in their brains. But for science, this is purposive, you know. We can do those things because we know that we will eventually understand something about how the brain works. And if we achieve our aim, then it doesn't matter how much waste is created along the way. So when I say that it's important for science to cross this barrier between the rational mind and the intuitional mind and identity, it has to do with our survival. One of the points that I've made a few times in this study is that the cause of the problems can't solve itself. The rational mind can't use its own powers to correct the problems that its own powers have created. So this is an evolutionary crisis. But the higher mind, what Sri Aurobindo refers to insightfully as the ideal mind, also he refers to it as the intuitive mind, which is a borderline between rational mind and supermind, is actually something that is within our evolutionary grasp. It's realizable. It's no longer necessary for us to think of this as something esoteric and obscure. It is quite realizable. Then we come to Sri Aurobindo's philosophy of how we realize it. And this is the most interesting thing. And how to say this without sounding offensive to every single person? It entails abdicating the rational mind. But as he says over and over in hundreds and hundreds of lines, that doesn't mean that then there's irrationality and randomness. Because there is an evolutionary status that has been achieved. And it's possible to carry on functioning quite happily and even better without it. Because that other formation, that higher intuitive mind, is available to us if we will allow it to do the things that we're so habituated to doing in an inferior way and being proud of. So the old adage from Patanjali comes back. Yogaha chitta vritti nirodha. It's necessary to still the mind in order for the self to be known. And that self has a higher dimension of energy and operation that is more universal than that busy mind. Of course, Sri Aurobindo points out that there's a risk here because traditionally, spiritually, that liberation has been taken to be an end in itself. But it's only, as he says, one radiant pace. So stilling the mind is a doorway into the reception of the ideal mind and higher than the ideal mind, the inspired mind and higher intuition that is ever present. It's already there, and we simply screen it off by our habits of thinking and acting unconsciously or semi-consciously or egoistically. So I would like to look at some indications that were given by Sri Aurobindo. In the synthesis of yoga, he says, and what I'm reviewing now are some of the steps that can be taken by us practically to allow that higher consciousness to operate in us. And by doing that, we initiate energies that stimulate that operation in others. Just like if we're raging around like Bible-maniacs, a la Mr. Trump, we initiate raging maniacal behavior in others. But if we generate something universal and peaceful and knowing, then we generate that in others also, because this is, after all, the field of consciousness. It never belongs just to us subjectively. So he says, given the self-differentiation of the divine in which we dwell, concentration is the means by which the individual identifies itself with and enters into any form, state, or psychological self-manifestation of the self. To use this means for unification with the divine is the condition for the attainment of divine knowledge and the principle of all yoga of knowledge. This concentration, that's what he's talking about. Concentration proceeds by the idea. Capital I. Using thought, form, and name as keys, which yield up to the concentrating mind the truth that lies behind all thought, form, and name. So if we have this idea of rising above the rational mind by abdicating its use and receiving from above that mind a vibration of seeing knowledge and seeing will, if we have that idea, then only can we concentrate on allowing it to function. We use the will and the understanding, the buddhi, the higher mind, to open to something above the mind. Simple methodology. It only requires the will. But that's not a small thing, because we have many wills. And we're mostly more interested in achieving petty things, which give us what Hegel called a kind of disinterested security. The security of the known. We can be disinterested in any higher truth because it's much easier just to flow in the already established grooves and to be proud of our little mental achievements. But this higher movement of will is qualitatively more powerful than the lower wills. And if we're willing to enter into it, as Gebser said when he was speaking about the integral consciousness, it brings about a change in the whole field of energy around also. So there are fairly immediate rewards to making that sacrifice. Especially if we happen to be in the mother's field, who is that force, then those rewards can be experienced immediately. But there's always, the back door, and we can rush out at any moment. Because there is something that is inherent in the absolute spirit of things called freedom. And this is the beautiful thing about Hegel. Hegel tells us that freedom is the will of the spirit. The spirit's will is absolutely free. And that absolute free will, if it manifests as right. And Hegel believed that, somewhat erroneously, that humanity had reached the stage then in 1820 or so, that because it was possible to know the freedom of the spirit and that its worldly expression would be in the establishment of right, which means welfare for all, and freedom for all under the power of the state, that the state would become an organ of the manifestation of that principle of will, and it didn't happen. So the higher understanding, the inspired ideal mind, wasn't able to bring about the transformation on the plane of life that Hegel had hoped would be possible. Then Sri Aurobindo comes along and uses almost identical language to Hegel, and he uses the exact same language that phenomenology uses. And there are big sections in the Life Divine which are phenomenological, according to the school. He tells us that even though the rational mind can conceive of these things, it requires another kind of freedom, another energy, another will. Now, Hegel said that thought and will are the same, that we shouldn't divide them and put one in one pocket and one in another. And this is the idea that consciousness and force are the same. And at the level of the amoeba, there's not much force and there's not much consciousness, but they're still the same. And at the level of humanity, consciousness and force are obviously the same, and whatever we're conscious of, we do, and it creates our civilization. So there's another level of consciousness and force to be achieved by transitioning between this rational will and its types of thought, and the supra-rational will and its types of thought. It's the emergence of a new structure. And that one can change the lower structures creatively, but not until it's established. Knowing about it isn't good enough. And having one or two avatars of it is also not good enough. It's a beginning, it's a drop. So there has to be a movement in a portion of humanity to make this transition, and it will have a quantum effect when it is adequately made. So Sri Aurobindo goes a little farther in this admonition. Regarding the ontological aspect of the paradigm of knowledge, which is to say that this is not just subjective, it's out there, everywhere. This paradigm exists in things. He says, this self that we are has finally to become, to our self-consciousness, entirely one with all existences. We have to see it not only as that which contains and inhabits all, but that which is all. Not only an indwelling spirit, but also as the name and form, the movement and the master of the movement, the mind and life and body. It is by this final realization that we shall resume entirely in the right poise and the vision of the truth, all that we drew back from in the first movement of recoil and withdrawal. So there are two movements. There is the withdrawal from the practice of the ordinary will and thought, And then there is the movement of identification with the all that the mind cannot achieve. It is impossible for the mind. It is another structure of consciousness. But when that transition is made, then the all is it. And we are no longer an egoistic center of abstraction and self-interest, but we are a dynamic pole of that all. This is the feeling and experience of oneness, which is real. It's not a philosophical notion. And it's within the range of human achievement. But it's a shift, requires and is a major shift in our functioning and our experiencing and our needing and willing. They shift into an entirely other energetic field if we undertake this process. And as long as we don't, we can be quite happy doing what we've always been doing in the same ways, with the same consequences. Are there any questions? I have 5 minutes left. As I said, this book has just been published this week, and I have 20 copies, and they cost 300 rupees, and I'm going to place them in Savitri Bhavan for sale. My other studies that I've made in this project here, the philosophy of evolution and the philosophy of religion, are also there for sale. And, you know, this is not a terribly sophisticated thing. It's rich and meaningful, but it's also quite simple, and the, you know, the quality of the publication is not great, and it's just a product of the University of Human Unity in Oroville, and it's not very expensive, but I sincerely offer it as the product of 2 years of research and thought and aspiration. And it does summarize this whole development from 1750 till 2015 or 16, including neuroscience and some living philosophers today like Evan Thompson, who are really bright and doing good work. And hopefully it creates a kind of context in which the integral paradigm can become more meaningful. Anyway, I would be able to take some questions in the next 5 minutes if you have any.
I have a question. How free is freedom? When you talked about freedom, Rod, I thought a quote came to mind from a man called Prentice Mulford, that freedom is the ability to gladly accept what we have to do anyway. So, which is very different from the freedom in a sense that you, in a certain sense, described, and what is often understood as the freedom to do anything without punishment.
I understand the question. And I'm gonna leap beyond all of the conventional answers. In the philosophy of evolution, and as in this philosophy of consciousness, I have really tried to identify something that is fundamental in the Vedas and the Upanishads that is difficult to comprehend. And that is that everything in existence is produced from the self, the producer in the Veda. So if we understand that, as Hegel says and as Sri Aurobindo says repeatedly, that this spatial temporal external world is not the reality. The reality is the infinite spirit. And the trick is to be able to see the absolute freedom of the spirit in the limited moment. You know, and Satyavan says that the descending consciousness of Savitri makes it possible to see the infinite in the finite. And that's the symbolic meaning of Savitri, the consciousness of Savitri. So, freedom is a spiritual reality. And it's not mental, and it's not vital, and it's not physical, and it never will be. But as in all idealism, all schools of idealism, we participate in those universal principles. And we participate in them to progressive levels of expression. So Hegel says that existence is not spirit, but existence is a manifestation of spirit in the conditions of time and space and history and possibility. So if we experience that absolute freedom of the infinite self that is creating everything all the time, then we have access to that energy which gives us leverage. Creativity, it's sometimes called. But imagine being, as Bergson said, aligned with the creativity of the universe. Then we are constrained in the way that evolution is always constrained by principles like homeostasis. You know, you can only create on the basis of what's already been created. So there are constraints. But then certain extraordinary leaps also become possible. Because you see possibilities in that freedom that you didn't see with your mind, or your vital, or your physical. So these hidden possibilities are there that could enhance the motion, the movement forward, if we could grasp them. But we don't have yet the instruments for grasping them. So we have to use this process of concentration and will to go beyond our limits first, and then that energy descends into this complex and can achieve a greater degree of freedom in the terms of structures that are limiting.
Thank you.
There was a freedom, a question of freedom. I like the answer. The freedom is not of desire or of thinking, but from desire, from thought. There is a freedom of the spirit. This description is very beautiful. But in Hegel, there is a definition of freedom, and I want you to comment on it. The conscious necessity is freedom. Conscious necessity. Of course, it is that dialectical vision that conscious necessity, so necessity is manifestation, and since it is conscious, you are becoming free. But it was abused or misused in Soviet Union because Lenin quoted Hegel, conscious necessity is freedom. It was made to be the socialistic state, you know. So, since it is necessary and you are conscious of it, you must do it. But I don't think this is a right definition of freedom, conscious necessity.
Okay, so that wasn't Hegel's definition. That was Lenin's application. And, you know, Marx came along, and there's a chapter on this in my book. Marx came along after Hegel and said, well, the reality of the proletariat negates Hegel's philosophy of spirit, because anything which cannot be rationalized as freedom by a process of intellectual negation would destroy the philosophy, and the proletariat destroys the philosophy. Well, this was the Marxist-Leninist view of the idea that the welfare, if the welfare of human beings in society were achieved, the material welfare were achieved, this would create happiness. Universal happiness would come as a result of the abolition of private property and the destruction of the class society. And so he was applying Hegel's negative logic to historical society. But Hegel's logic said this freedom of the spirit is not the existing world at all. The existing world can only mirror in a very fragmented way the freedom of the spirit, which is infinite and absolute. But because there is that spiritual absolute freedom behind or above that is manifesting in force, it's possible eventually to have an ideal state which is not absolutely free, but at least it's, it provides welfare. And he said this welfare that can be provided by the state may require violent revolution. He was not opposed to that idea. So Marx wasn't completely original in that sense. And so the Soviet Union is an attempt to demonstrate practically something which the master never conceived of as being possible by a change of governmental structure. He thought that governmental structure could be improved and that welfare could be enhanced and that the system of right is never the ideal. It is just a relatively good thing. So we have the freedom as human beings to create a relatively good thing because of the absolute freedom of the spirit.
Perhaps we can think of freedom from 2 points of view. Freedom of and freedom from. You have freedom from hunger, freedom from exploitation, freedom from poverty and deprivation. Then freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of worship, or freedom of no worship. And in a way, last few thousand years, we have been struggling with both these freedoms. We have freedom of expression, but we often don't have freedom of thought. I mean, we just many times abdicate that freedom of thought. So I think we keep swinging back and forth between these two large sections of what is freedom of and freedom from.
May I add that there's also freedom to kill ourselves, kill the planet, and the rest of it.
So the spiritual philosophy is the understanding that the freedom from and the freedom to are relative expressions of the idea of absolute freedom. And the idea of absolute freedom is the good. Freedom is good. And this is idealism. And from Plato to Hegel to Sri Aurobindo and the idea of supermind, it's always the same. Absolute freedom is absolute good, and whatever happens here on earth is relative to that. So we are moved constantly to achieve something better because that spirit of absolute freedom is in us. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a clue about how to make things better. We wouldn't have a consciousness of the way forward. But we do. And we are sometimes not able to achieve it, even if we have it, because there are resistances. So the idea of Savitri and the descent of the supermind is that the resistances need to be broken by a power higher than the human will. But the human will then needs to attune itself to that power and exceed itself.
I would like to add that the word free or freedom in English means love. Why? Because Freya is the Germanic goddess of love. And in Arabic, freedom means al-hurriya, selfless and total love.
Right. Absolutely right. They have the last word.
Last one. No, because it's enchanting me always. This very simple statement by the mother, I think, where she said, which is smashing for our normal mind, I would say. She says, freedom is the utmost slavery to the divine. If you let that sink in, beyond the rational mind, then something may happen.
I think that's like the Mulford one. It comes close, that comes close to what I was saying about Prentice Mulford.
Yeah, it's all related to that. It's so straightforward.